All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this edition of CBAN's Lunch and Learn. I'm Curtis Dean, one of the co-founders of the Community Broadband Action Network. Other co-founder, Todd Kielkopf, is also on the call this noon hour. And our third partner, John Ann Willow, is probably, out digging out of snow in the upper portion of Michigan near Traverse City in her woodsy place that she lives. I've been really looking forward to this lunch and learn because we're going to talk about a topic that all of us have experienced, all of the panel that you see here in person, as well as just seeing the trends in the industry. And that is efforts by groups trying to block municipal and community broadband networks from happening. So it's my pleasure to introduce, in addition to Todd, our two panelists, Doug Dawson with CCG Consulting. Doug has been on our Lunch and Learn before. He's a wealth of knowledge, and I would encourage you all to regularly read his Pots and Pans blog. Doug, you've not missed a day in 20 years or something on that blog, have you?
Nah, it's only since 2013. So.
Okay, only since 2013. Okay. Well, it's always really interesting, and I just don't know how you do it, honestly. You must be like the Stephen King of blog writers, because it just comes right out of your brain. Also on our Lunch and Learn today is Christopher Mitchel with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I got the initials in the right order this time, Chris. We've had
always
Chris
appreciated.
Yeah, we've had him on before, and I have this dyslexic thing with the initials for the ILSR, so I always have to triple check before I start to make sure I got those things in the right order. So, gentlemen, thanks for being on today. I'm going to take care of just a little bit of housekeeping here. Well, my screen just froze, so as soon as I unlock the screen, I can do all kinds of housekeeping here. I want to acknowledge our CBAN associate members. These are the companies that are part of the CBAN family, and they are the ones whose dues support all the activities of CBAN, which in 2021, we do certainly hope and pray will include some in-person gatherings, which we were unfortunately had to not be able to do in 2020. There's a lot of pent-up demand for FaceTime, and I'm not talking about the thing you do on your phone either. I'm talking about real FaceTime. So we're tentatively planning our broadband summit for October, and we'll get more information out as soon as that is nailed down. The companies you see on this list are supporting us in those ventures. Want to acknowledge our newest CBAN associate members just since our last call, our last Lunch and Learn. EX2 Technology, Innovative Systems, Ovation Networks, and TII Technologies have all joined the family. So we want to thank them very much for their participation. All right. Again, a reminder, those of you who are on the call, CBAN membership is free except for the associate members, and those dues are listed on our website. Our #1 goal for CBAN this year is to grow that membership, not just the associate members, but all the other membership classes. In fact, I just had, right as I was setting this up, I had somebody from Michigan, Northern Wisconsin join as a CBAN advocate member. Somebody who is part of a task force for rural broadband in their areas. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. Keep that conversation growing and to more and more people. So we encourage, if you're a community, you're a provider who is focused on community broadband services in your area, and that's whether it's municipal or not, as long as you got that customer and community focus, you are welcome to be a provider member. And then advocate members would be individuals that are just trying to advance the cause. So there's the commercial for today. All right, I want to show an ad. Can I do that, guys? Because this one I love. So we're going to be talking about these anti-municipal groups. So I thought I would start with something that's really fresh in my mind and probably in Todd's mind too. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that the anti-municipal groups do on a local level to try to stop referendums from taking place. Many of you know that in Iowa, you have to have a referendum, for example, to approve a municipal telecom utility. That's a necessary step. In Colorado, you have to have a referendum to opt out of the state law that prohibits municipal broadband. And there have been, what, Christopher, 100 of those referendums in the past few years, something like that.
Yeah, 120, 140, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, so when it gets down to that, there's a vote happening, and that vote is something where citizens in that community go to a polling place, just like they vote for president or senate or house, and they say, do I want this or not? And one of the places that had a referendum fairly recently, about a little over a year and a half ago, was Fort Dodge. And the city of Fort Dodge placed on the referendum on the ballot in the November of 2019, and basically to ask for authority for the city to operate a telecommunication utility. A group known as the Taxpayer Protection Alliance decided they didn't like that idea. And so this is a commercial they ran a lot, primarily online, but I believe they also did some TV on this. So let's just share this little nugget of truth.
Looking for internet that might never be updated?
Sluggish. I like it.
Internet that could raise your property taxes or your electric bill? Then you're looking for government-owned internet.
Oh, yeah.
The facts show it's a bad idea. Don't let your city be another statistic. Simply put, government-owned internet. Big debt, huge regret.
Paid for and authorized by the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Not authorized by any candidate, candidates committee, or ballot issue committee.
Void were prohibited. Prices may vary in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. I love the fast talk at the end for the disclosures. So
I hadn't seen that before. I had not seen that.
You had not seen it? Oh,
No.
No, me either.
It's amazing. When you have like 6 things on a list and you want it to look much bigger, then you put it on a very slow scroll up.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's exactly. And the same 6 have been on the list for the past 20 years. So, so that is the Taxpayer Protection Alliance. I can tell you based on our experience that they've had a very big presence in Iowa, because we've run into their paid person here in the state of Iowa at many public meetings that we've had at communities that are looking at better broadband solutions. Wanted to bring this up because this really illustrates several of the most common themes that you see, common tactics you see used by anti-municipal broadband groups, whether they be some legitimate sounding think tank like the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, or maybe it's just a provider itself that doesn't want competition and is lobbying against these referendums. Some of the common themes you find every time is that, number one, cities don't know what the heck they're doing. You saw it in the line, internet that might never be updated. Ooh, as if they're doing a great job of updating their networks, implying that cities are stuck in the mud. They're old-fashioned. They don't adapt technology. They don't know how to operate a business, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a pretty common one. The T word, taxes, is always a big part of these attacks. Even though in many, if not most cases, there are no tax implications to building a municipal broadband network, because most, if not all of them, are financed primarily through revenue debt. And never are reflected on a tax bill. But that doesn't stop you from saying it's going to raise your property taxes. They always like to talk about facts, where they will provide so-called failures, like you saw on that slow scrolling list there that Christopher mentioned, where the facts they show are really more like snippets of information without context, and generally cast a misleading story on that community. You saw Muscatine on that little list there as a big failure. Such a huge failure, in fact, that while they've been able to refinance it and rebuild their entire city to fiber in the home, and such a failure, in fact, that the previous cable company just decided to leave town because they lost all their customers. So those they paint as failures by finding little bits of information there that don't let the facts get in the way of a good argument, in other words. And finally, another one that on this ad, and there are other ads I've seen, this is basically an implication that debt is bad. The debt won't be repaid. That a city is going to build this network, and they're going to borrow a bunch of money, and it's just money down the drain. There is no acknowledgement that that debt has to be paid over a period of time and is paid through the revenues that it collects. So that's our friends at the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, and that's just another example of kind of these anti-municipal referendum things that you see.
Hey, Curtis.
Yeah.
I think we should also start by letting people know that if that was the case, then there wouldn't be advocates for it.
Absolutely.
If you put that list back up there real quick, what we know in the industry kind of is why we're even having this conversation today. It's because if the business plan can't support an update of an entire technology cycle 2 or 3 times within that business plan, we would never recommend that to a policymaker. If the property taxes wasn't also, yes, ultimately there's not been a default onto a tax base, but what we do know is that property taxes are reflected of property tax base, and they're not everything, so the health of a community over 20 years, it's not that much different than investing in a TIF project that ends up having an employer that, like in Inola had one, the left town was, and there was tax base though that was held that benefited the community. The facts, yeah. I mean, there are studies, but studies can be manipulated. However, like you said, the refinance, and yeah, the debt usually gets repaid. So, if not, refinancing happens all over the American economy. Cities do it all the time. Businesses do it all the time. In fact, that's nothing different than what just Frontier just did, was default on a bunch of bondholders for the entire, by purchasing customers, not investing in their base, and then turning around and having low revenues, no infrastructure, and then refinancing the debt in bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all just what I would say is, what we try to say is, yes, if these were the bad things, we would like them to be better and not recommend them.
Exactly.
But yet this model actually augments those in the total broadband picture, not just public.
So Doug, Christopher, you've encountered a lot of this over the years in your travels, and Christopher, probably you've probably documented more of this than any of us have seen. Maybe share some of the things that you've heard, some of the messages you've seen on that local referendum level over the years, and some of the tactics you've seen used.
Yeah, I'll just kick it off, hopefully quick, because I'm sure Doug and I can go back and forth with y'all. There's one that you missed, which is very common and applies to the 3 of you all, but not me. You are all billionaires because of your lucrative consulting contracts. That's a common enemy, is the consultants who are just here to charge exorbitant fees and make it big. And I will say that, like, I'm not going to generally defend consultants. I feel like there's as a profession, there's a lot of areas in which consultants don't do right by their clients. In this space, the consultants that have been at it for more than 10 years, for 20 years, like Doug and others, they have a history that you can look at. And first of all, they're not millionaires. They're people who care deeply about this and work in it, and their advice can be checked. You can see, what did they say 10 years ago, and did it come true or not? I trust Doug because I've seen the advice he gives his clients and what the results are. And then another one is just outright lies, robocalls that spread just lies that are indefensible, often conducted by firms that are from out of town. So there's others, but those are 2 that we see regularly with these referenda.
Well, and let me jump in. Let me give you 2 examples of actual tactics and referendums. One was in Chris's backyard. This was years ago. The city of North St. Paul did a study, and they had to have a referendum to get it passed. And they had done a survey, and the public was overwhelmingly in support of broadband. The day before the vote, and it turns out that this referendum, this was the only issue on the ballot that day. 6 bus loads of 20-year-olds popped into town the day before the vote, knocked on every door in town, and went through your list. Property taxes are going to go. Did you know property? Face to face, none of them ever told the people who they were from. We don't know. We assume it's the cable company, but they didn't identify themselves, but they knocked on every door, and sure enough, the referendum lost. Completely blindsided. And North St. Paul's not a big town. It's a little tiny town surrounded by St. Paul. And so the referendum just got creamed. And what we think probably happened is people just were dissuaded from going to the poll in the first place is what happened. It's another example.
As a St.
Go
Paul resident, talking
Yeah.
to folks that were up there, in North St. Paul is a separate municipality, but there was this sense of like, when you ask people why they were voting, they would be coming and say, I'm not really sure, but I know I have to vote no. And
Right.
there was a sense it was not what we'd like to see in terms of the ideal referendum of people having cast informed choices. And I guess that's something we can come back to is what proper expectations are on these votes. But I just want to say, like, there was definitely this sense that like people weren't like, I've weighed the options and I've decided to vote no. It was a lot of people who said, I just have to vote no. That's what I understand.
Yeah, the second example was one of the earliest ones, and it was in this Lafayette, Louisiana. And somebody who was probably Cox, or it could have been AT&T, but again, never identified, paid for a push poll. And this was a true push poll because it never actually solicited any responses. The questions were like, did you know that if Lafayette launches a system, because they're a city, they're not allowed to have cable on Sundays? I mean, just the most, and there were like 100 of these questions. And actually, I should have pulled this up ahead of time, but if you search on the web under Lafayette fiber
I have the link.
referendum, the entire a guy recorded the whole darn thing, John St. Julian's. They called him and he recorded the whole thing. It's just amazing. There's almost no legitimate questions out of the whole 100. And it was just a smear. I mean, it was just a smear. It was the whole thing: property taxes, cities are clowns. I mean, it's unbelievable lies in this push poll. And so
it was even worse than that, Doug, because one of the questions was specifically elicited to exacerbate racial tension.
Oh yeah, it was just horrendous.
I mean, it was just that is one of, and that's we'll say that's not something we would expect to see in most places. That was an extreme. But these people that are often people with questionable morals who are being hired by other people who might have been themselves gotten money from yet another party. And so they're just, it's sort of a race to the bottom in terms of tactics in some cases, because these are not campaigns often conducted by a person of good standing in the community that is worried about their reputation after this campaign.
And to go back to the St. Paul one, those busloads of people were not hired directly by and interviewed by the cable company. It was 3 people down the chain. By the time somebody hired them, this was a completely ugly situation. And that's exactly what happens. So yeah.
A lot of times the providers will want to insulate them from that direct point.
Oh no, they act surprised. It wasn't us. It was these cockamamie organizations that don't exist. Yeah, we would never do that. So
one of the common things we've seen lately is commercials of people in traffic. And this is actually more common prior to the pandemic when we got into traffic jams regularly. I've been in one in the past year, so it may not be as as effective. But in Fort Collins, for instance, there was a bunch of these that said, your city is about to spend and then an inflated amount that's well beyond what the city was really likely to spend on broadband. Wouldn't you rather have them improve the roads? Wouldn't you rather have this other thing rather than this wasted money on broadband? So that's a tactic that hasn't worked great, but is like one that I think can resonate in the right places.
Well, they ask enough questions that they're hoping one of them sticks with each person is what they do. So if you throw out 11 lies, they hope that one of them gets to each of the people they grab. So it's really an ugly thing to watch. Luckily, over the years, the vast majority of referendums have passed. So these tactics turn out not to work. But the one in North St. Paul was very effective. That's what killed it. I mean, that was as effective as could be. So.
I wanted to bring up something that happened here in Iowa. You mentioned Lafayette, that was 2005. The same year, we had a whole wave of communities vote on the same day for Municipal Broadband Authority. And that was, I believe it was 32 or 33 communities voted. About half approved it, about half did not. But I looked up the statistics from that campaign. There were several different groups that just appeared out of nowhere to fight those elections across the state of Iowa. One was called Project Taxpayer Protection, which sounds incredibly legitimate. Most of its funding came through MediaCom, and that fall, that particular group spent $1.82 million to defeat the elections. Another group called the Citizens for Common Sense Solutions, which was primarily coordinated by Iowa Telecom, which then became Windstream. They only spent about $60,000. So that they obviously didn't have the cash. And then there was a third group, Iowa Competitive Telecommunications Coalition, which was primarily financed by Quest. They dropped another $30,000. All told, just under $2 million was used by those groups to say vote no in those referenda. And all the pro-muni spending total across the state of Iowa that year was $92,000.
Now, I have to jump in and say there is nothing wrong with the incumbents lobbying against a bill that hurts them. They have every right in the world to do that. They just shouldn't do it with this long list of lies.
Yeah.
You know, if they came out and gave legitimate discussions about, you know, how they think they're doing a good job, that would be a different situation. So,
yeah, that's absolutely true. And you know, we've had that conversation with people. It is a person could be legitimately think it's a bad idea for philosophical reasons. They don't believe that government should have any role in something that's provided by the private market. That might be a legitimate underlying concern, but then you take that underlying philosophy and you apply a bunch of garbage statistics to it to make an argument. That's when it becomes really kind of disgusting.
Yes. One of the things that I think is worth discussing is this threat of how much money it is and the idea of debt being bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually much more fiscally conservative than anyone suspects. I'm very interested in how government is financed, how programs are financed, and I think it is well worth considering how one is structuring debt, what kind of debt is being contemplated, how long it is. But at the same time, it is worth remembering these projects are just not that big in the scale of things for most cities. This is a project that is probably on par with a sports stadium in a major city, or is on par with a major bridge, a major road project. Fiber optics are expensive, but they are inexpensive compared to the cost of building electric networks, water networks, sidewalks. Like, it's just, there's a lot of things that are more expensive than fiber optics. And so cities can make investments that are poor decisions in general. My organization is very anti-incinerator. Some cities that have built incinerators, the scale of that investment, if it goes very bad, can bankrupt the city. Wow. There is no municipal fiber project on the scale that could bankrupt the city, no matter how bad it got. That is just the scale of the investment. I mean, in the worst case scenario, the city would have to raise its taxes. People would be frustrated, legitimately so. Elected leaders would lose their positions because they abused the position of trust. But this is not something that our children are going to be saddled with the debt of unnecessarily. These investments are just not that big.
Well, and the flip side to that, Chris, is no citizens are going to be upset if they fund a network and it does go south, because they still have the network. And a good example is Provo. Provo had to open an open access network. It just didn't work out. What happened to them was all the ISPs just sort of died. They were down to 2 ISPs, and they just basically sold it to Google Fiber for $1. It's a more complicated story than that, but the people in the town are still enjoying that network. It didn't, even though the city had to pay the debt off, no, people aren't mad about it because they still have a fiber network to everybody's house. Right. So there's not a big downside to this stuff. So
there are a few people mad about it, but I would say it's not a majority, is from what we can tell.
Yes.
So, because it's up in your neck of the woods, Christopher, let's talk about what is the town that was mentioned? Monticello. So let's talk about Monticello, because that seems to be the whipping boy of these anti-municipal. You see it almost every list.
it's interesting because they'll say things like, the problem with Monticello is that you should have a public-private partnership for this sort of thing. And they seem to forget that Monticello is a public-private partnership. and Doug actually knows this story very well too. But Monticello decided that they wanted to work with a local company. They built a network and they got sued illegitimately. The lawsuit was tossed out of every last one of the courts that considered it, as fast as that court could process it. And it was viewed as being entirely without merit. Nonetheless, the city lost a year, and the city never recovered from that. And at the same time, Charter Spectrum, which this part of Charter Spectrum, the folks who make these decisions, they have done this elsewhere too. They engaged in the most fierce predatory pricing that we have seen ever. This is 10 years ago. And Charter Spectrum came in and said, we are going to offer $60 a month service for our best broadband and every last channel that we offer for 2 years at $60 a month, $145 a month package in any other city in Minnesota. And they offer that for $60 a month. And so the city and its partner struggled to get enough customers then to pay their debt. And they ended up giving the bondholders a haircut. Now in the city, they had to then subsidize the network moving forward, and they still do, with funds that they have from their liquor store, because in Minnesota, you can have a monopoly liquor store run by the municipality, and so municipalities use that for special projects. And so no one's taxes really went up on this, although you can make all kinds of arguments about those tax dollars might have been used for other things, that taxes were raised to pay for whatever. Like, I'm just trying to be as honest as possible in this. In Monticello, you have one of the most competitive markets in the upper Midwest for service, where you have one fiber to the home network, one network that is fiber in some cases to the home, in other cases is not, from TDS, and then Charter offering these ridiculous deals year after year in order to make sure it's not losing customers. So people in Monticello have saved at this point more than $10 million cumulatively from lower costs from that competition.
Which, by the way, is more than the cost of the network. So.
Yeah. Curtis and I talked to policymakers a lot about that. Is not everything that's going to happen or could happen is going to show up on your balance sheet. I mean, you have to know that. And so we're really brutally honest about that going in, but you need to find success in as many broad ways as possible, whether it be your tax base or your customer bills or avoided costs for municipal services. Just make sure that you have the way to capture the data and that your leaders are going to appreciate it. Then you can be more bulletproof. Because I know a lot of communities that got in 2000 really didn't do that here in Iowa. And then when it came time to rebuild or redo or extend, the idea was, well, you're not doing good enough. And it's like, well, let me come up with these measurements. Well, you just made that up. Oh, no, it's not my fault. You didn't define it well to begin with. Yes. I mean,
well, let's kind of move to a little slightly bigger picture. We've been talking about the anti-muni groups and actions that they've taken at a local level with referendums. We got to remember, referendums are not even something that is needed in some states. And in other states, there is no process whereby a municipality can be involved in broadband. So let's talk a little bit about the success or lack thereof that these anti-muni groups have had on a state level of pushing for and advocating for and lobbying for laws that restrict municipals from being involved.
Well, I live in the poster child states, North Carolina. Wow. So the restrictions here are essentially, what happened here was Wilson Greenlight built a fiber network, and immediately the lobbyists for both AT&T and at that time it was Time Warner, it's now Charter, came in, and they've always been an extremely powerful lobby here, both of those companies. They got a restrictive law passed that essentially is a complete prohibition against, I mean, cities can't even let people on their water towers if you read the law, for wireless. Really? It's just incredibly restrictive. A few cities, 2 or 3 have thumbed their nose and done things anyhow and never got sued. But if anyone large did it, they would use this law to stop them. And this goes back to the fact that, the big companies, AT&T, Verizon up in the Northeast, CenturyLink, in certain states, they get everything they want because they have, 3 full-time lobbyists to protect their turf. Anytime a law is written, they write the words.
Yeah.
And so they wrote the anti-municipal bill, and over the years it's been challenged almost every year, and there's never been an inch of movement on it. And this is even now when we know that the rural parts of North Carolina have dreadful broadband. All of the rural legislators want better broadband, and yet they can't get their act together to overturn this bill, because the lobbying is so effective. And so, and we're not unusual. There's lots of states with the same problem like Texas. There's just states where the lobbyists are incredibly powerful. And of course, we have exactly the same thing going on the federal side. I mean, the last FCC that just left, the big carriers absolutely controlled that FCC. I mean, there's nothing that came out of there that the lobbyists didn't write the language on.
So
It's really embarrassing to read these documents and go, I can read AT&T right in that word, So
it's also worth noting in North Carolina, there was a bill to roll it back last year, the NC Fiber Act. It had enough co-sponsors from just Republicans alone to pass in both chambers, and leadership would never let it come up.
They never let it come up for a vote. That's how
because they
they
knew, and that's so AT&T and Charter Spectrum, they have that lock, and it's one of those things where, okay, so maybe we would document how much money they've given them. The problem is they've given so much money in dark money. That's what matters. And so the public money is like this chump change that doesn't explain why the Republican Party in North Carolina is so beholden to AT&T and Charter Spectrum, but they are.
And now, it's the dark money because it's under these same cockamamie groups that you were talking about. They get money from 7 different groups, and altogether, the legislators know they're all AT&T and Charter, but that you can't point to it very easily. So, yeah.
And so you actually have Republicans running for office, and it's never clear to me. I mean, it's hard to explain exactly what the motivation is, but there's a lot of Republicans in North Carolina that are at odds with their leadership on it. And the question is whether anyone can actually make that change leadership's position on it. But there's actually good stories out there. We have not seen a state enact new bans for many years. It's been attempted in a few places. What we've seen instead is these groups lobbying for places like Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Virginia, and others to, when they make broadband subsidies available, only make them available to non-public entities. And Ohio has gone so far that even cooperatives were not qualifying. You had to be a for-profit company to tap into the subsidy program that they were building. And so that's the latest front of attack, because we've been pretty successful at starting to roll back some of these things. And Arkansas just repealed one of the more stronger preemptions on municipal networks, not entirely, but they have opened up a whole new door, and we're going to see that in a few other places potentially. Doug has commented on Washington State. Nebraska has a bill for the first time in a while. I mean, we're seeing different conversations than we had seen previously on this.
Well, and here's the good news to even further expand what Chris said. Broadband is at the local level is not a partisan issue.
No.
You can't find a rural politician who's against building broadband, because they wouldn't last for the next election. Where I live, every single politician in Western North Carolina, on their first little short sheet of their 11 policies, pro broadband is always on the top 3 or 4 items. So, they all are going to vote for this. So that's amazing that those restrictions stay in place, and it's because of the power of the lobbyists. It's just unbelievable to watch it happen. So.
Christopher, were you surprised to see that Arkansas bill get traction so quickly? Because that again has been a intractable state for such a long time.
So I don't know. I've been giving credit to Senator Breanne Davis. She had pushed through a bill, I believe it was 2 years ago now, that modestly rolled back, just allowed cities that got grants to build networks. And I feel like she really educated the caucus, or perhaps other people with her. But I think they basically viewed that as giving notice to the incumbents. I mean, you look at CenturyLink, Frontier, Windstream, and AT&T, and they collectively received $250 million from the Connect America Fund. And Doug will tell you that probably not one single person in Arkansas got a better connection as a result of that $250 million in Arkansas alone. And I think the legislature had enough. So this bill was originally going to be very clear that cities could even do retail. It was going to blow all of the preemption out of the water. The first committee that it hit in Arkansas, they basically stripped out that language to make it clear that cities could engage in partnerships. Electric utilities would have no problem doing services, but it was not clearly stated that any city could offer retail broadband. It's still possible. It will depend on how the courts interpret the language. At that point, no one dissented against it. It passed unanimously through both houses because I think people are just fed up with the incumbents.
Well, and Chris just pointed out a really important distinction. North Carolina has a lot of cities, and because of that, here the lobbyists for the cable companies and AT&T still have a lot of sway. If you go to Arkansas, where most of the people are served by Frontier and CenturyLink in rural with DSL, they've lost their battle. They've lost their battle on the street because everybody hates them. You know, they are now just so dreadfully hated in those states. So that, you know, the carriers have lost their ability to even turn the politicians in Arkansas. And so you're seeing that in those kind of states. But here, we have way too many cities here that the lobbyists still have some sway with those urban, guys. And so, unfortunately, and it's not that we don't have bad ISPs here too, but it's not as percentage-wise as many. I mean, if you drive around Arkansas, you can drive for 2 hours by houses that don't have any broadband. I mean, it's terrible. They're like the third worst in the country. It's dreadful.
But they're going to be doing so good. I mean, they have like 8 electric co-ops that are building rural fiber.
Right.
Like there's just Mississippi, Missouri, and Arkansas are 3 states to watch that are going to go from toward the bottom to the top in the next 5 years.
Right.
Well, they deserve it. They've been the ones suffering for this long. When we talk about these state by state efforts, I think it's important for people to understand that these don't all operate on a vacuum. They're not each little state lobbyist deciding to fight in that state. There's groups like ALEC out there that write these laws, and they basically hand them down to friendly legislators in each state. So I haven't heard much from ALEC lately. Not ALEC, but the American Legislative Exchange. Is it Council?
That's right.
Are they still out there putting together sample legislation that's anti-broadband, anti-muni, or have they moved on to the battles?
I haven't heard from them either. I mean, Chris would know more, but I think that that's probably not as high on their list as other issues right now. So I'm sure they're still handing down sample language because the language they wrote 5 years ago is still good. But yeah, you don't hear about them at the same. They used to be just everywhere.
I think. I mean, I'm guessing that's where some of this language that limits subsidies going to public systems is coming from. Yeah. But honestly, I think the single greatest source of anti-municipal fear, uncertainty, and doubt comes from the University of Pennsylvania, where Chris Yu put out a report in which he made numerous factual errors, some that were so egregious he actually retracted them in a quiet press statement. Although he never fixed the paper. This is such a corrupt center. It just happens to be in Philadelphia, home to Comcast. He just happens to take Comcast positions on a bunch of stuff. He puts out a paper that erroneously claims that he just totally misunderstands and misstates the debt of Wilson, Chattanooga, and Lafayette in order to slander them and suggest that they'll never pay off their dets. When in fact, two of them will in the next several years. Yeah, like they're not only doing fine, they're paying off their debt like 10 years early in several cases. Yeah. Right. And then in like 20 other systems, he writes this report. This uses this like ridiculous accounting to basically say that these networks are never going to pay for themselves using his fictional accounting. And so newspapers report this credibly because it's from the University of Pennsylvania, an institution that is considered Ivy League for some reason. And then they, at the same time, don't bother to check with ratings agencies to say, hey, supposedly this debt is crap and is never going to be retired. And why are you giving them such high bond ratings? And when the bond ratings look into it, the agencies, they'll say things like, actually, we think the fiber network improves Chattanooga's bond rating because of the way it's brought economic development and a stronger tax base. And so what's really frustrating is the he said, she said reporting that treats those claims as credible, in part because they're impenetrable accounting mumbo jumbo that then suggests that these networks are not succeeding when everything suggests they are paying off their debt early from what we can tell.
Now, I want to point out that those papers except in rare circumstances, don't filter down to the general public. These are written for exactly the states we were talking about. Those papers ended up being handed to the politicians in North Carolina to provide cover for them to continue to vote against it. And so that's exactly their audience as politicians with those papers. Now, they sometimes do damage because some of the nonsense about Lafayette ended up being reprinted in a Lafayette newspaper, and they spent a year describing the difference between real accounting and accounting in this paper, because it was just nonsense. And for a year they had to go like, no, we're good. Let me show you why. Of course, nobody understands accounting, so very hard thing to describe properly. But
right.
but normally those don't filter down. And when they first started coming out in the early days, 2005, they made news. Nobody pays any attention to them anymore because there's so many obviously dumb, stupid lies in them, but occasionally they still filter down. So.
Well, the Taxpayer Protection Alliance stuff is ridiculous. I mean, they put out paper, and we actually have a section on muninetworks.org. If you go under resources, under learn, correcting community fiber fallacies, in which we respond to these claims, just so people will have a sense. But like the Taxpayer Protection Alliance will put out a paper in which they say, look at these 200 municipal networks, they've all failed. Right. And then within that, they categorize the networks based on different things, one of which is whether or not they've failed. And by their own status, by their own counting, they will say 14 of them have failed or something like that, which is just bizarre. And then they'll claim the other ones have failed because they have debt. Although somehow AT&T, who's taking out like an extra $15 billion of debt right now, is not considered a failure if debt is supposed to be that bad.
And Wall Street is wondering if they can afford that. I mean, they are truly getting themselves in a precarious position, but no one's talking about that.
Right. So it's only when cities have debt that even if everything's going well, that's considered a failure, which is a confusion. But let me bring this back to the original point of the referendum and Lafayette, which is that what do you do when you're confronted with that? In Lafayette, one of the reasons that they succeeded is because the mayor said, I'm gonna have a press conference. I'm gonna explain this. Debt isn't bad. He didn't say, oh, let's just hope that nobody gets convinced by this. He didn't say, let's ignore it because I'm focused on other things. He said, this is a priority. We're gonna talk about it. We're gonna confront it, and we're gonna be bold. And one of the things that I'll say right now, like, I feel like in these things, we try not to be partisan, and this is not a partisan statement, except for the fact that if you bring up Donald Trump, people have partisan reactions. People love Donald Trump because he's perceived as fighting for them. And if you have a mayor who's out there saying, yes, I'm going to fight for you on this issue because I want you to have better broadband, that's going to work a hell of a lot better than if you have someone who's saying, let's just hope that people see through this nonsense.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Now, Chris is the only one I know who still responds to all these papers. I gave up years ago.
Oh no, we'll ignore most of them, but every now and then, I mean, like, that's the thing is that if a reporter is looking for gets a paper and it's the first time covering this, like, I think it's important to show them, like,
Right.
So.
Who's the guy named Rizzuto that pops up once in a while?
He's from Colorado.
Okay.
Yeah. He's another one of these guys who's just always been in the tank for the cable industry.
I always think of a Yankees second baseman or whoever, Phil Rizzuto. That's who I always think of his name.
Well, unfortunately, when you talked about consultants making a lot of money, I suspect these guys get a whole lot of money for these poison papers. They're probably the consultants making the most money because, it's pretty easy to write a paper full of lies. You don't have any research time.
Well, this is something... And a lot of these people are academics. And so that's part of the reason that you see this is that it's assumed that an academic has no biases or at least no structural biases. But one of the things I found fascinating, if you go back and you look at the organizing to create the cooperatives that electrified America, it is really interesting how many academics were bought and paid for by the electric industry, published paper after paper about how this would never work. It was a disaster. What we're seeing today is not at all different from what we've seen before. Centralized capital. Big, powerful companies will pay any number of people that have flexible morals to write lie after lie and just keep flooding the zone with garbage because it works. And not perfectly, not always, but it takes a lot of work to counter.
I mean, they certainly didn't stop electrification, but they delayed it. Right. So
you sent me that slide and I completely forgot about it, Christopher. So I'm going to see if I can find it.
Yeah, pull that up.
That's from 1906 from the municipal battles.
And it looks just like the new stuff.
The wording is the same. And like the thing that I love is this idea that like if you let municipalities build electric systems. It will be the end of the free market economy for the United States of America.
Right.
And that is why Bernie Sanders is the emperor, and he's really bored because socialism has so totally taken over America because 2,000 cities operate their own electric grids. These statements are so ridiculous. And one of the things I think we need is more people like me, who else doesn't believe that, that really love markets and wants to see true markets established in more marketplaces. Need to be very clear that like this is a very pro-market investment that needs to happen.
Well, and that's an even better point because we have to all stop and remember that DSL is dead or dying. Cable companies are becoming true monopolies, and so people in a lot of markets, even where the broadband's relatively fast, have no choices. And so, a municipal provider, even if they don't bring anything else, brings choice. I mean, monopolies, and we have unregulated monopolies. I mean, it couldn't be hardly any worse than what we have. And so, it's one thing to have monopolies in electric where they are granted official monopolies and they're actually regulated, but these unregulated cable monopolies are just, I mean, I personally believe Comcast's goal is to have $150 broadband rates in 10 years. And so, I mean, they're just marching right down that path. And I don't know when we're going to wake up and yell, that seems like a lot of money. So.
Doug, you've told me, if you don't mind sharing, how much is the average household paying today for broadband?
It's over $70 in all the studies we've been doing recently. And unfortunately you have people out there. There was a whole series of articles last month going, everyone, 85% of the people in America have a choice for cheap broadband. Like, no, they don't. They can go out and buy $50 DSL, except AT&T won't sign you up anymore. But for actual broadband, it's now at 70, and that was before the January rate increases, Chris. So it's now $4 or $5 higher. It's going to be $100 in about 3 or 4 years. So,
most of what we try to tell cities early on in the process is, yes, you do have to have investments that have to be repaid, and those investments are going up in cost. But the problem is that out of your $70 bill, roughly 40 of that is going to a connection or a board that once it's paid off, you shouldn't have to pay again.
Well, and I should have put a footnote on my 70 because if you're a Comcast customer, that doesn't include the $14 for your Wi-Fi modem.
Yeah.
$14.
But I think that's what policymakers have to understand is we're not saying that we're just saying pay for the road once,
Right.
Pay for the roadway once. You don't buy right away every time you put in a highway. You buy the right of way that you need, you put a highway in, and you only have to replace the sub base every 50 years, and you never have to buy the right of way again.
So about this slide.
I love this slide because other than putting on a more modern font,
this is
pretty much.
This could be an ad in the paper today.
So
right.
It's one of the reactions I sometimes get from this is people saying, yeah, but electricity is so easy, which first of all, it never comes from people that actually run electric systems.
Right.
One of the things to understand is that at this time, if you open up a newspaper, you find a story of someone being electrocuted. Like this was a technology that has become much safer now because of professionalism. Electricity is dangerous still, far more dangerous than fiber optics to work with. And on top of it, it's actually really complicated as you're dealing with all these new generation sources and all kinds of things. So if you hear anyone suggesting like, oh, well, cities of course could handle electricity, but they can't handle the massive complication of a fiber optic network. No, cities need to take it seriously like they did with electricity. And unfortunately, some cities may not take it seriously enough. They may screw it up. Some of those may be disasters. Some of them may be turned into successes, like Utopia went from being a disaster in Utah to being what looks to be a stirring success moving forward. So yeah, I would just say that we've seen this time and time again, and I do think something Doug said earlier is worth repeating. The goal of these folks is not always to win; it's just to delay. Because if they get 5 extra years of monopoly profits, that's billions of dollars.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
well, that's where it comes from, though, is the fact that they didn't have to rebuild anything, in terms of that capital cost of any significance. And so it's just we like putting that out on the breakdown so people really understand early on what we're talking about. We're not talking about the $30 or $39, you know, maintenance and upgrade and operations fee and bandwidth. You're talking about that infrastructure. And that kind of shifts the argument back. That makes you draw easier parallels back to electric, back to the road, back to things about, you know, about splitting that bill.
Right.
And we found that to be a more effective argument. Once they understand that, wait a minute, I paid for that 3 times. I said, well, somebody's got to pay. You're going to pay no matter what internet you want to have in this town. You're going to pay that infrastructure construction cost no matter what, because guess what? Their bill's not going down on the competitor. So do you want a new one that you build on the infrastructure, or do you want one that you're going to keep renting?
That's why.
How many times do you think rural people have paid for the copper network?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I don't even want to do the math.
Well,
Yeah.
this is important though.
But
I mean, when Doug says going to $150 a month, I'll pay that. You know, like if it gets there, I'm going to pay it, right? Yeah. If my electricity bill quadrupled, if it went up by a factor of 10, I would be more efficient, but I'm going to pay it. You know,
Yeah.
This is what essential infrastructure is, right? Like, and that's why it's so important not to have an unregulated monopoly.
Well, hey, I'm being cognizant of time here. I just want to turn quickly to anti-municipal actions on the federal level. We've talked a little bit about the FCC before, and now a transition to a new FCC with some different people on there. How do the anti-municipal groups get the ear of policymakers at that federal level? Same way they get it.
Same way. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's interesting things. Like if you watch, if you go back, Marsha Blackburn is just totally AT&T, like 100%. Oh, I should say like 90% AT&T, 10% Charter Spectrum. She just crucified what's his name? The guy who runs Facebook. When he was on the stand, you know, and people were just like, wow, where'd Marsha Blackburn come from? You know what? AT&T fed her that. You want to bet?
Right.
Like Josh Hawley, major fan of AT&T. Guys going up against AT&T's enemies. AT&T is loading him up so that he has all the ammunition he needs for his populism. So it's to understand, like, not only are they, you know, getting campaign contributions, they have these alliances that further their brand, that help them. And so, you know, Tillis, from Senator from North Carolina, you know, he had personal dealings with Charter Spectrum back in the day that were detailed, and he still has, you know, this anti-municipal fervor. And so there are people that have this relationship. I mean, it's like, you know, the prison industrial complex is like a similar, like telecom, anti-tech kind of complex that they've built up. And so they're there. And then you have another senator, you know, like Shelley Moore Capito, for instance, who really wants to see better broadband in her state, but this isn't her number one issue, right? And so like she's hearing from her colleagues on these issues, and to her, municipal broadband sounds a lot more like something that Senator Bernie Sanders would be supporting than something that a conservative would be supporting. So this breaks down among partisan lines weirdly at the federal level in ways that it just does not at the local level.
Well, and unfortunately, we just had an FCC chairman who was very much in the pocket of the big guys. And that's just, we haven't had that too many times in the past. I mean, that was so blatantly unfortunate. So yeah, I mean, he was able to really change the rules. So
the FCC seems to have become much more politicized over the past decade or so.
Yeah.
And that should be, I think, concerning to a lot of people, because
well, part of that is Congress's fault, because they haven't updated the Telecom Act since 1996, and so the FCC has to kind of make up what they want to do, and that's unfortunate. They shouldn't have to do that. So
I saw a post saying celebrating the 25th anniversary of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and my first thought was, why are we celebrating something that is like 20 years due for an overhaul?
Well,
when dial-up internet was only in
it was passed when AOL was big news.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it is worth noting that depending on the Congress at the time, a lot of us would prefer stagnation to what we would see if AT&T was able to rewrite it. You know, this is again something in which if you look at whether you look at North Carolina, you look at states like California, man, Democrats can't get enough voting for AT&T in California. Like this is something that is not, again, breaking down where you can just think, oh, I often agree with Democrats. Democrats are in power. Obviously, if we rewrote the Telecom Act now, we would get something we wanted. There's a lot of Democrats that are really in Comcast pocket. So,
well, you have to remember that the state of California had a $100 million grant program, and right before it was going to be handed out to the public, it all went to AT&T and Frontier.
Ugh.
Nobody else. And so and this is a democratically run state, and so that it's not a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's a who the lobbyists got to issue. So
money talks, and it doesn't talk partisan. It talks.
No, it does not. It does not. So.
On municipal broadband, I think it's this weird complication because it does come down to party line, oddly enough, on municipal broadband. Perhaps it's because it's a smaller issue. At the same time, on these larger issues of telecom, it can be much less clear. Right. But I would expect that if we see the Congress getting rid of barriers to municipal broadband, we will predictably see Democrats line up in favor of removing those barriers, and Republicans largely, but not entirely. Like Chuck Fleischman, who represents Chattanooga, he's bucked his party line. But the last time we saw a vote on these issues, there was like 3 Republicans who voted for it and maybe 2 Democrats who voted against it. I mean, there's just remarkable party line cohesion on municipal broadband specifically.
But there's no guarantee it would pass, right? So,
right. So, Christopher, I got an assignment for you and the Institute. Maybe you should adopt a scorecard for elected officials, kind of like the NRA would always have their rating every year for whether
501c3s cannot do scorecards. I'd have to create a 501c4.
All right, there you go. Well, Doug,
you could feed a scorecard to me. I'll publish it. I'll publish it.
I have a strong respect for keeping nonprofit dollars out of politics. So
I have to agree. Yes.
What is the section of the code or the laws that Koch brothers use to have their dark money that is educational or something?
I think those are C4s largely.
Okay. Well, C4 is also a big explosive.
Well, so you can. As a C3, you can do a certain I can do a certain amount of lobbying. And the issue with a scorecard is that even though I can do certain amounts of lobbying, I cannot endorse candidates. And so a scorecard would actually have to come from a pure non-taxpayer subsidized source. I get that. But I can do some small amount of lobbying as long as it is not within certain limits.
Right. And you're not handing out checks.
Not today.
Well, hey, I think our time has expired. I do want to go back to our group that's watching right now. If anybody has any questions, just go into the chat and type those in. And feel free to do that here the next couple of minutes. We'll kind of do one more go around here with our group. And then if there are any other questions at the end, I'll chime in on those. So is this anti-municipal effort going to get better or worse or remain about the same? What's your crystal ball tell you? I'll start.
I think it's getting worse. I mean, I don't know that it'll be effective. I think we're going to see more attacks. We've seen more recently at the Phoenix Center, which is the AT&T Center. They've been doing more anti-municipal stuff. And as we see citizen movements in Portland and Seattle and a number of other places moving forward, Toronto now announcing it's doing municipal broadband with this pretty limited open access type approach. But a mayoral candidate in Boston talking about it, Tucson talking about it. As larger cities consider it, there will be pushback and there will be more attacks from those groups.
And I would agree. I would say the attacks will get more fierce, but I don't see states reversing their positions on it.
Agree.
I mean, so I think the rhetoric is going to get louder because I'm all of a sudden working for a lot of mid-sized cities, and they never really were interested before. So, so as bigger cities, you're in a state where a few of them are doing it. When that starts happening, that really fires up the incumbents. So,
well, it feels to me just like the environment for municipal networks now is as good as it's ever been, and that COVID has helped put additional pressure on local decision makers to solve this problem locally, and that's going to be hard momentum for those anti-municipal voices to overcome, which probably explains why they are likely to become louder and more shrill as time goes on, because they'll see that maybe they're losing the battle.
I think there's a little bit of a bubble forming that concerns me.
Okay.
We're seeing more people saying we want municipal broadband, and what they mean is not I'm going to spend 5 or 6 hours learning what that means. What they're saying is I want cheaper prices and better service, and I want it tomorrow. and if we have cities that don't do their due diligence, then it will be easier for the opposition to capitalize on those in a few years. It's very important that while I love the enthusiasm, several people in each community have to educate themselves on joining a group like this, learning about what the best options are, what to look out for, and things like that.
Absolutely. That's, if it's a decision that's going to be made, it should be an informed decision, not a reactive decision. It should be based on the facts at hand on your at a local basis. And you need to take into account all those local factors that only people that live or operate in that area are going to understand. So that's the caution for communities that are looking at solutions. It's not a hurdle that you can't overcome. It just is something you need to identify before you.
Well, the good news there is we're seeing a lot of small communities solving it. I mean, more and more of them are making this work. So
yes.
We call that the neighbor effect.
Exactly, 2,000 people at a time is how it's getting fixed.
We're actually seeing it, I think, in Iowa, the growing up effect, that if this town can do it and that town needs to do it. Mm-hmm. The one thing I would say is that is encouraging is that even if you're just entering in and we end up with more conduit type utilities and legislation where the community has some control, just because it is realized finally that there's no provider out there that has the dollars to solve the problem that the customer has at the massive scale. And so your mid-sized and smaller town communities that don't attract those dollars may not get the opposition, or there may be smaller players that get in that space to leverage those more than what we've had in the past, just because the dollars aren't there.
One of the things I'm excited by is North Carolina, in part from the Institute for Emerging Issues, in partnership with the state, is doing this thing called Band NC, which is creating local plans for counties to develop. Arkansas is putting money into feasibility studies. Maine has talked about this before, and I think that is the next step, is not necessarily to unlock billions of dollars from the federal government, which would be fine, except for the fact that we don't have enough organizations ready to capture that on the ground today. We need to be building those relationships locally. I think we should see more matching funds to localities so that they can form these groups, talk about the assets and challenges that they have specific to their community, and really develop a way that they would use some money that might become available to them.
There's actually quite a few other states that are now starting to fund that, Chris. I mean, Florida just started. I mean, a lot of states are putting that money out there. So, yep.
Would you send me a list or do a blog post on it?
I only have one in my head. Yes.
Yeah. But it's a good blog post. You can pool that together, either regional planning together or pool their investments together, so you can pool the risk and attract more private capital. I think that starts taking the argument away that it needs to be private capital only into a provider. I don't think anybody's saying that. We'd love to be able to get private capital from outside investors at favorable rates. It just can't go into one small town market. It's got to be pooled, just like the portfolio of a large provider is pooled. Yeah. So,
well, hey, gentlemen, I so appreciate. I knew this hour would melt away quickly, and it sure did. So, thank you for your expertise. We may have to revisit this topic another time, and who knows when these groups will rear their heads and make us want to take another look at it. But again, I want to thank our guests today, Doug Dawson with CCG Consulting, Christopher Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Curtis Dean, Todd Kielkopf with CBAN. Thank you for everybody for attending, and we will see you at our next Lunch and Learn, which is coming up on March 10th. We're going to be talking about a new approach to feasibility. So keep watching Broadband Bites for more information about our next Lunch and Learn. Thank you, everybody.